I'm lost in your haze where the lights are low, drowning in the depths of your eyes. I'm ready to go. In the shadows we'll find our way. Through the night our love will stay. In your love I'm lost, I'm found. In your heart my home is bound. Forever I'll be yours, you'll be mine. Lost in your haze, our love will shine. In your love, I'm lost, I'm found. In your heart, my home is bound. Forever I'll be yours, you'll be mine. Lost in your haze, our love will shine.
These are a statement about, what I believe about sustainability and about sports and about adults and counterculture, right? And as we grow into a space where we're driven to try to, challenge and think about big meanings and engage with perspectives and emotions and social issues and broad, important existential questions, be they in physics or be they in art or be they in the social civic domain, right? What do? We double down on controlling the input and the output transactional mechanisms that count as quote unquote academic rigor and achievement, right? We start to ask kids, what's the name of the servant who shows up in the scene in Great Expectations, right? Is it Molly or is it Maria, right? And it's, who the heck knows? And that is not the point of reading Great Expectations, right? We take away because we're afraid. As educators, as society, we've got this narrative around young people's in particular, but everyone's propensity to build and construct meaning in these spaces and self in these spaces. That agency frightens us because we're worried they're going to take risks. They're going to do something stupid. They're going to fall off the track. They're going to not make it in the traditional system. And in trying to protect them and shield them from their own curiosities, their own dispositions for meaning making, I would argue, actually stunt their ability to grow themselves to the point where we have mental health crises, literally crises in mental health right now in adolescents across demographic groups.
Especially bad in young girls, as I understand.
Yes, yeah. That's right.
But
it's bad in everybody,
yeah.
And it's worse in girls. Yeah. Yes, we don't fully understand why that is. Get some, suggestions. What we're really doing is actually producing people who are gutted of their own inner drive to become someone who thinks powerfully in the space of the world. We are frightened to let our young people have that power, which is the role of adults, is to wrap around young people and help them learn to be reflective, to be systematic, to be rigorous with themselves as they develop the capacities and dispositions to deconstruct their own beliefs, to deconstruct their own aims and goals and the ways they understand the world, and to rebuild them iteratively over and over in this sort of intellectually humble, curious way, where we're constantly querying ourselves, constantly querying other people, where we're willing to sit with uncertainty in complex problem spaces and think through the possibilities rather than settle quickly onto one solution. What does school expect you to do? Settle immediately onto one solution, which, by the way, is the solution I already had in mind when I gave you the question, right? As compared to sitting with young people and allowing them this in safe and appropriate ways, the space in which to actually grapple with complex, powerful questions. When kids develop the proclivities to do that, they learn how to manage those very human capacities that we've been talking about the whole time that can lead to, terrible evil as well as amazing virtuousness. They learn to appreciate and manage those capacities within their own selves.
I think so much of what we see in terms of these, quote unquote, failure to launch examples are because I know some of these, the children of friends, really, really smart kids that didn't map well to the system and therefore are not doing well, really struggling, and clearly have the intellectual power. It just wasn't served up to them, and school wasn't served up to them in a way that worked.
Yeah, it says as much about the system as it does about the kid, right?
Yeah.
That's right.
I teach a course at Stanford to the medical students that every first year medical student takes about neuroscience. It's team taught. It's a phenomenal course.
Cool.
Because of the range of expertise in the teaching that comes through. And one thing I've noticed is that they're all phenomenal teachers, but the best instructors do two things simultaneously when they teach. First of all, they come to the table with incredible expertise, obviously.
Yes, you have to deeply understand what you're trying to get at if you want people to engage with ideas.
Yeah, they are true luminaries in their respective fields: addiction, pain, memory, every system of the body and brain that relates to the nervous system is taught in this course. But that I've noticed every once in a while that there's a subset of them that as they teach from that position of expertise, not only are they clear, not only are they engaging, not only are their slides sparse enough to understand, but rich enough to include all the relevant detail, but they also flip back and forth from the position of expert to the position of novice learning it for the first time.
Yeah.
It's
That's
almost
that
like
intellectual curiosity that they're keeping alive. They have this disposition we're talking about cultivating. Sorry to cut you off.
No,
that's right.
Please do. As academics, we're familiar with that, right? Interrupting in the landscape of academics, interrupting me is a sign of interest. I think Carol Dweck was the one who told me that.
Did she? Okay, yeah. She's right.
Thank you,
she's
Carol. Right. Carol says she's right. The great Carol Dweck.
Yeah.
And so, but I've seen this, especially, so, there are some topics that, I like to think that I might do this reflexively for, because, like, for instance, I started off in neural development and I adore the topic. So I can't teach neural development without being completely blown away in the positive sense of how a brain develops.
Yeah.
I've still never taught this or
right?
done a podcast on it, because it tends to require visuals. And we don't use those because the podcast, most people listen to the podcast. But maybe I'll do something just for YouTube at some point. But I think it's the same experience occurs when I see somebody, like, Dr. Sean Mackey, who runs our pain clinic at Stanford, teach about pain and the systems of the body that relate to pain and emotion and how to cure certain forms of pain, et cetera, treat pain. It's like he's clearly the world expert, but the way he describes the system, you can tell he's learning it again for the first time in parallel to all of that. And I feel like that ignites the emotional systems of the learner's brain in such a powerful way, that is distinct from just hearing an expert talk about something.
He's not a squirrel with nuts and giving all the nuts to the kids. He's inventing the knowledge in front of them, right?
That's a great way to put it. As usual, others are more succinct in collecting my ideas and expressing them than I am. So I think that's a powerful thing. I went to a high school that's, has a kind of a split reputation. It's known as being one of the best public high schools in the country. It's also the high school that, at least for a while, had one of the highest suicide rates in the country. Right. It's written up in various newspapers and so on. And so much so that nowadays they forbid the kids there from meeting more than an hour before school to practice for the standardized tests. By the way, when I was at school, the only thing that school represented for me in high school was something that came between breakfast and skateboarding, and and frankly, I wasn't in school a lot. And I don't recommend that kids go to school, stay in school. I missed a lot of school.
I traveled all over the place. And did all kinds of weird things.
I had a lot of making up to do in college, as a consequence. So stay in school, get the basics. But this is actually where I'd like to go. You have a very interesting trajectory. Yeah. Here you are, you university professor, you study emotion and learning and many other things across cultures and adolescence and so many other important topics. But you are not a story of like growing up in an academic family. You grew up on a farm.
It's sort of gentleman's farm. My
Yeah.
dad was a surgeon, but
Okay.
we had animals and a farm and my parents tried to have us, growing the things we ate.
You've had a number of different experiences that we were talking about before we started recording, but one of the things that you mentioned was getting involved in education, where you were exposed to students who had very different backgrounds than you.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could just talk a little bit about sort of the nodes of your experience. So you grew up on this farm, and then maybe just hit some of the other nodes, and then let's take a foray into when you first got exposed to educating others.
Yeah.
And because I think that's an important backdrop for what we've been talking about here, and serves as a jumping off point for where I'd like to go next.
I'll just jump in. I mean, it's always hard to talk about yourself. I don't know what's interesting and what's not. You know what I mean? To me, it's just me.
I think what's interesting is knowing, where you've been and the things that mapped back to your emotional networks in a way that for you feel like that mattered in terms of what you're doing now.
As a little kid, I remember, even as a little kid, not liking school. I was a very good kid. I was a very well-behaved kid. I went to a decent public school. But just the whole idea of it, I just always felt like I had two left feet. It never felt like it was really me there. I was always trying to escape a little bit. You know what I mean? And thinking about when I first started educating others, and my first memory of educating others, specifically that comes to mind, is I was 6 and I went on a little vacation in the summer to stay with my cousins in Petoskey, Michigan, which is a place on Lake Michigan where there are these stones where there's, my understanding from when I was 6 is that there are these 200 million year old fossilized worms in these stones. And you can see them when you look at there's little worms and you can see them. Yeah. So I just was fascinated by these stones, that these are actual fossilized 200 million year old worms. And I don't know if that number is correct. That's what I remember from age 6. So some paleontologist out there can correct me. But I collected these stones and I went to the little local exhibit they had at the library or whatever, and I learned about these stones, and I brought some back, and somehow somebody thought to ask me to teach my 2nd grade class when I started school about these stones. And I just remember, I don't know how I got asked to do this, but I remember standing in front of my class and talking about these stones and just looking around the room and suddenly noticing, that feeling when you're lecturing and you think, oh my God, they're fascinated by what I'm saying. Every kid is looking at me and holy crap, and so I'm like, all right, I'll keep going. I'll tell you some more about these stones. And I passed them around and whatever. And it must have been okay because I was then asked to give that talk all the way up to the 5th graders who were way older than me. And
you were a professor.
Right? So
you were a professor.
I was already fascinated by the natural world and able to make meaning out of something in a way that inspired other people, if I can be so blunt as to say that. And yet I was constantly in trouble at school for not having my homework. I was just, the feeling of release on the Friday afternoon and the feeling of dread on Sunday evening is hard to describe, and I went to a reasonably well-resourced school, anyway, fast forward up to when I was older. I mean, I was just always fascinated by, and I think some of this comes from my mom too, trying to, speak different languages, engage with people who are different than myself, just have conversations. So from the time I was old enough to barely qualify to do these programs, my parents had the resources, luckily, to be able to let me to do these things. But I went off to France and stayed on a farm there for a summer, and went to, Ireland. I went to Russia. By the time I was 18, I was working with these little kids off the street and camping with them in southern Siberia and all these kinds of things. When I went,
as cold as they say in Siberia.
It was gloomy and rainy and muddy and cold. Yes. Yeah.
Siberia always sounds so bleak.
Oh,
my parents threatened
bleak.
many times to send me there.
Oh,
No.
yeah. No, that's a real threat. I mean, it's beautiful in many ways, but, that was sad. It was a sad story. Anyway, I think what I was trying to do was actually learn by doing, by being, by engaging with other people who knew things I didn't, learning how to, build things. I was always really interested in woodworking and boat building. I went to Kenya and spent 8 months there as an undergraduate, right? Documenting this traditional dhow construction in northern coast of Kenya. Dhow, which are sailboats. Sailboat construction where they have no electricity and everything.
cabinetry.
Yeah, cabinetry. You know what I mean?
So you can
After I
actually build
graduated-
furniture. So when people say
Whatever.
they built furniture, but they basically assembled IKEA furniture, that
Yeah,
we're not
I
talking about
have
that.
built cabinets and built-in bookshelves
Awesome.
and furniture. Whatever. Some of my friends have pieces I made for them. I didn't make anything for myself, so I don't have anything. Yeah, I mean, I think I was really torn between trying to build things and learn by engaging with other people and in these different cultural spaces. You know, being a woman in a cabinet shop in Connecticut is really not a cultural space that I had grown up in and then gone, you know what I mean? And yet, right, moving myself and changing myself to adapt to these different situations somehow felt like learning to me, I think. And I ended up in a strange situation where I cut my hand, opening a window at a job site, and I was on workers' comp and I had to take, some time to let it heal, and I couldn't run machinery. So I had to figure out what to do with myself. I was 23 years old and I was not going to go back to my parents for more money, right? So I thought I have to support myself. So I thought, okay, I went to college at a high level Ivy League school, and I majored in French because I could. That's basically what I was like. I don't know. I better finish. I better not flunk. I can do French. I speak French fluently. I'll do a French literature major and done with it quickly. Then I'm like, what am I going to do with myself? I never thought I could be a scientist, but I loved science. So I just went around taking like a year of every science. I took a year of astronomy and a year of biology and a year of physics and a year of, human anthropology, paleoanthropology, like all these things, psychology, and realized, holy crap. Like, this is super interesting. You can study how babies think and the natural world. And then also, be bringing sort of a scientific lens to bear that helps you understand things in a new way. So here I was as a 23-year-old with a cut hand, and I thought, what am I going to do with myself? I convinced the Massachusetts Board of Education that I, had the background knowledge to be able to teach some, sections of AP biology and physics that they had in their high school. So when I got to, finally got an interview with this, public school district in South Boston where they were desperate for a teacher. Like, I'm noticing in the Boston Globe, we're 2 weeks into the school year and you still don't have a teacher. You know what I mean? Why don't you take me? And, managed to convince the Massachusetts Board of Education, to give me provisional teacher certification based on the coursework I'd done and how well I did in that coursework. Because I did, I was really super motivated. I did extremely well in all of it. And when I got there, they basically said when I showed up for the interview, the high school teacher wants to take those AP classes. Can you just teach full-time 7th grade? So I was like, okay. So I had my full contingent of 130 kids, right? 7th graders coming through my classroom. And the middle school had just been shut down because there wasn't sufficient funding in the town for it. So they had taken the middle school kids and pushed them into the high school space. What that basically meant is I suddenly found myself in a fully equipped high school classroom with microscopes and all kinds of scientific equipment that would be used to teach later courses with my 7th graders. And it also happened that the Massachusetts Board of Education had changed the requirements for the way they organize science instruction and curriculum from, 7th grade life science, 8th grade physical science, whatever it was, different sciences each year. They wanted an integrated interdisciplinary science all the way across. And of course, that was very difficult for the traditional science teachers to do because they'd been teaching only biology or only earth science or only physical science, for their whole career. And they didn't know how to teach the other subjects. And here comes me with like one intensive year of study in each of these domains. I was perfectly situated to like try to pull it together. So some of the high school teachers helped me. Thank you to them. And I built out a new curriculum for 7th grade for that district around this interdisciplinary approach to science, together with other teachers.
It was very hands-on.
Very. And it was very much like a web of concepts. We'd study nuclear fission and atoms and reactions, and then the sun and astronomy and the solar system, and then how the energy is being, shined over onto the planets and then the earth, and then these organisms called plants are actually using those photons to do something chemical. Let's talk about photosynthesis right? And then we can talk about chemical reactions and breaking down sugars and molecules, and right. So we built this whole web-like curriculum that I was trying to help the kids appreciate the sort of dynamic complexity of the natural world. And some of my professors from Cornell also sent me materials and all kinds of cool stuff from the Cornell Museum that they didn't really need. And then I gave it back when I was done, right, with all these instructions, what all this stuff is on hominid evolution and Acheulean hand axes and all kinds of stuff. So I built out a curriculum around all this stuff. And I realized for the first time that I was in this amazingly fascinating space, because it just so happened that the school I was working in was one of the most diverse culturally in the nation at that time. I think we had something like 81 languages spoken out of 1,100 kids.
Wow.
That's a lot of first languages. And kids were arriving from all over the world. This was right after the Rwandan genocide. So kids were coming in from East Africa. There were refugees from Kosovo and Eastern Europe. There were kids coming in from Jamaica. There were kids coming in from Haiti. There were kids from Malaysia and Myanmar. Like there were kids landing in that class like deer in headlights from very, very broad ranges of cultural backgrounds. And they're landing in my science class. And what I quickly realized is they were using these scientific ways of exploring the world and thinking about questions and trying to make sense of what they had witnessed to try to understand their own sort of selves, their own origin story, their own place in the world, why different people in this class look and eat differently than me, dress differently than me. Like, how is it that you look like that and I look like this? And there was all this crazy, adolescent turmoil layered into this space where kids were grabbing onto the scientific ways of knowing as a handle to try to make sense of who they are. And those kids started asking questions of me. I'll never forget this one girl, a black girl, who raised her hand, and all the other kids are looking at her like, yeah, ask it, right? And like, she was being brave. Like she talked about it before school. Like, I can't say that. And they're like, yeah, no, say it. And she said, Miss Immordino, why is it that when we're studying hominid evolution and you show us this Nova episode with early hominids in Africa, why do they always show those creatures looking like they have dark skin? Why do they always look like black people? And I was like, well, because they're on the equator and you need that level of melanin in your skin to be able to adapt and live without getting skin cancer in that space, right? And it opened up this amazing class discussion that actually went on for months. Like it evolved into a whole curriculum that was biology, it was culture, it was sociology, where we started to really unpack the ways that we as humans are natural beings in the world and the ways in which our cultural experiences are extensions of our natural ways of adapting. And that had me hooked. I realized then that I could bring science, right? The science of adolescent development and of learning and of emotion and of culture to this very pressing real world problem of how do we help our kids actually figure out who they are, invent themselves in this crazy multicultural space and become scholars and intellectuals who engage systematically with the ideas along the way. And so I took those ideas and I started going to night school at Harvard Extension School to study cognitive neuroscience and to study language and cognition and, all these kinds of topics, and quickly realized, like, I really needed this developmental perspective infused, right? I wanted to understand not just how these things work, but how they got that way. And so I took that back to grad school at Harvard and began to study social and cultural and emotional and cognitive development in kids. And quickly there also kind of hit a wall where I went back to the school district in which I worked, and I went back to the teachers who were my colleagues, and I worked with them, and I observed their classes, and I interviewed their students, and we did all kinds of work around how kids were building scientific concepts in ways that reflected their cultural concepts and ways of approaching the world. And I quickly realized, it seems to me that kids are doing all this meaning making, and we as adults are doing all this supportive, meaning making. We're also engaging and growing and learning in ways that reflect not just, knowledge bits like little computers, but also that reflect the biological substrate on which the learning and the thinking are happening. And I wanted very much to understand how we could use and leverage developmental biology as a kind of constraint from which to appreciate the kinds of theoretical frames we were inventing in the real world, sort of anthropological educational space, the developmental psychological space. How could these two systems, act as a Venn diagram, and how could the intersection between them, the places where the theorizing about the natural behaviors and the way kids were making meaning and learning and describing their knowledge and engaging with each other on the one hand, and the ways in which the brain and the biology are engaging in or supporting those processes on the other hand, the places where those two circles would overlap, it seemed to me that was where we could most directly target to start to deeply understand the nature of our developmental psychobiological growth and selves. And so I set out to try to study about the ways in which culture and sociality shape the brain, and physiology and survival mechanisms and development. And at that time, which wasn't even that long ago, it's like 2 decades ago, quickly realized, very, very little was known, about the way in which emotions beyond things like fear, I flash a snake in your face and your amygdala lights up, right? Like, I was thinking of something a little more nuanced, you know what I mean? Like, what I'm seeing happening in science class among a kid from Kosovo and a kid from Rwanda as they're trying to figure out why they understand how they look different, right? Those deeply emotional conversations they're having, but they're not so cut and dry as the things we had been studying. And so that's what really drove me to try to start to understand in an integrated way the way in which our biological development and our psychological development are actually sort of two sides of who we are and of how we're organizing ourselves to build capacity, mental capacity, as well as sort of physical health and capacity over the course of our lives as we're engaging with living.
Incredible story and foray into what sounds to me like really your ability to identify how the universals among us, like the universal biological features, the universal psychological features, can really strongly inform specifically what's happening now in a classroom interaction, in the mind of you or somebody else or of any of us, but to approach it from the other direction. In other words, to take what's happening now and say, why is what's happening now happening?
Yeah.
As opposed to just saying
what is actually happening underneath the surface, right, of the behavior.
Right. As opposed to saying, okay, this is the psychology of character structure. This is the biology of the hypothalamus, but rather say, is anyone else really shocked about the school shooting in Nashville?
Yeah.
And go through the feeling of shock and go from there to the biology as a route of learning. Again, and of course, I don't want to take away anything from the real world seriousness of that.
Yeah.
But it sounds to me like you saw that there's a different portal through which to teach and understand experience, and that we are all, but especially young people, are really tied to our emotional states as the main filters by which we like that, dislike that, and therefore make decisions and move through life. I mean, I think it's so key that early on, if we like a teacher, oftentimes we like the subject. If we happen to fall in love with, figure 4B in a paper, great. But that's not how I went through graduate school. I just was blown away by the fact that sperm meets egg, you get a bunch of cell duplications,
and
then you get a brain,
you get a brain,
and then
like,
you get
you're
a brain.
Crud, how does that happen?
I was just
right?
like,
That's crazy.
Amazing. And I was blessed with a graduate advisor who literally told me, this is how it works in my lab, is what she said. She said, we have everything you need here. I'll help you if you need help. But basically, you're going to mess around with stuff. You're not going to burn down the lab. You're not going to kill yourself with any of the poisonous stuff. But then you're going to like mess some stuff up and do some stuff, and you're going to figure some stuff out. This was literally the description. And I liked her lab because they had green countertops and she had pictures of interesting animals on the wall. And then she said, and I'm going to have 2 kids while you're in graduate school. So I'm not going to be around very much. You're going to have to figure it out on your own. And I said, well, can I play the music I want? She said, sure. And I said, can I put tinfoil on the windows? Cause I don't want to be bothered. And she said, sure. And I was like, okay, this is the place for me. In other words, she gave me a room to explore.
Yeah.
And of course, she gave me a lot of guidance along the way. She was an amazing, amazing graduate advisor. I'm extremely blessed. Mm-hmm. But it sounds to me like that identifying what's really going on now is key. And that the other thing that's key is an openness to ideas. I mean, earlier you talked about, kind of let's just admit where we're at right now. We're in a culture war right now.
We're in a weird space right now.
It's very divisive. Mm-hmm. And one of the major problems is that we can't really talk about things. Yeah. I mean, I think, fear of getting canceled, fear of, exploring ideas is real. Absolutely. It's very real, not just for academics. It's just real. People are it's important to be sensitive to the experiences of others. Absolutely. But if we can't actually explore ideas and feel like we can walk out of the room safely, then we can't really explore ideas. And so, I think right now it's not just social media. I think it's the fear of offending anybody. And probably the fear of voicing how upset certain people are about their experiences or the experiences of others, whatever it is. I don't see a landscape right now where there is true open exploration of ideas anywhere. Yeah. Anywhere, at least in this country. So, what do we do if at least 2 of the requirements are, an emotional gripping of something around the learning, plus an openness to thinking about things that maybe we don't feel right to us as a way to learn how to think, something I think we both agree, if I may, that is really critical. Yeah. And that the world would be a far better place if people could do that. Mm-hmm. And how do we navigate this landscape? Mm-hmm. I mean, is what has to come first, a demonstration of the value of openness and of ideas? And here I'll just state my stance. I feel like any idea should be open to at least discussion. Mm-hmm. Any idea. Mm-hmm. But then it needs to be systematically dissected with some rigor, so that people can't just assume any idea is true.
Or
just
any
because
idea
it's
has
true
merit.
for them. Yeah, because it's true for them. Mm-hmm. And this I actually learned from my graduate advisor. She used to say, tolerance has to go both ways. Yeah. Like when it comes to thinking about ideas and criticizing, it can't just be I'm right, they're wrong, or I don't tolerate that. It has to be tolerance for all ideas. Mm-hmm. And then you arrive at hopefully eventually core truths, or at least core trajectories. I mean, what do you think could support this? How early should this start? I mean, should kids in elementary school be discussing the current landscape of politics and what they see from a place of, like, we talk about safe spaces, but is a safe space one in which no one gets offended, or is a safe space one in which any idea can be discussed? I think that's never really been defined for me.
Yeah. Ooh, that's a really fraught issue. I mean, first, let me go back to something you said, which I would have said it differently. So you said our emotions are a filter, right? And they do act like a filter, but I actually don't think emotions are really filter-like so much as they are the drives that are undergirding the impetus to think, right? Mm-hmm. They're pushing us to think about particular things. And I think, I mean, as a scientist, my disposition is always that to understand something is good. And the more complexly, the more thoroughly you can interrogate and understand something, the better. So there's nothing I'm afraid of knowing, right? And what you're really talking about there is the fear of knowing. Why are people so afraid to engage with each other, basically? Because it's deeply threatening to reveal things about your own experience that are not going to land in a space where we can kind of collectively engage with them as legitimate experience. It's sort of the opposite of canceling people, right? It's the opposite of dismissing people. It's actually developing spaces of trust where we can engage with ideas and take them from ourselves, right? So that they're no longer personal value judgments. They become cultural memes or models or schemas that we can dissect together, that we can engage with together and construct understanding around, right? And I don't really understand my own position unless I also understand your opposition to my position, even if I still disagree with you. I think there are really important conversations going on right now. I'll take it back to the education system because that's what I know most about. There are really important conversations going on right now around reframing the experience and outcomes and aims of schooling around civic discourse and reasoning. So there was just a major report that was produced by the National Academy of Education and other academies collaborating with it, for example, around this topic, and helping us to move as a society toward a space where we learn to kind of lay ideas out and develop skills for reasoning around those ideas, including bringing ethical, experiential, emotional, cultural values to bear, but then being willing to deconstruct and engage with those ideas, whether they're the ones that are commensurate and fluid with our experience or that appear to be conflicting or disfluent with our experience. We need to develop a spaces for young people, especially, but for everyone, to engage with the deconstruction of our own assumptions, like I said before, and to engage with the deconstruction of others' assumptions and to try to reconcile the building blocks. And that's where we can build some common ground, but we can also disagree. But we don't really understand our own position unless we appreciate someone else's disagreement with our position, unless we can actually articulate and appreciate how it is that person's opinion is opposed to mine. I don't really understand mine.
It's such a key point. One of the reasons why I do read all the comments on podcasts on YouTube, it takes me some time, but I do it, or on social media, is that oftentimes I'll get a comment or a criticism that makes it very clear that I wasn't clear about something. Mm-hmm. Other times I'll get a comment or a criticism that makes it clear that I and the other person fundamentally disagree about something. Fine. Both of which are great, and for a scientist is a delight. Yeah. So keep it coming. And of course, when people agree and they agree and make it clear that they agree from a stance of understanding, that of course is also gratifying. Mm-hmm. So it's exactly what you're saying, and it's one of the upsides, I think, of social media, which is that unless people block their comment section. And I do occasionally block people if they're being offensive to other people. Yeah.
That's
you say whatever you want to me.
That's alienating people. That's not inviting people into a conversation. That's not constructive.
I actually have a rule, which is, I call it classroom rules. Mm-hmm. I've never announced it, but I allow for classroom rules. You can swear, but you can't swear at people. Yeah. That's what I was taught in graduate school.
That's nice. I like that.
Swear, but you can't swear at people. It's also our rule at home, although we try not to swear. So you can swear, but swearing at people is not okay. Yeah. And that, a certain decorum of, is required in order to have open discourse. Mm-hmm. So that works for me. I think that, it's been a while since I've been in school, but I work at a school. And I think that the ability to, not just reinforce, but challenge one's own stances, which sometimes leads to reinforcing our own stances.
It very well may, and that's legitimate.
I mean, I have to assume that in high schools, they still do debates. and things of that sort. I mean, do they allow that? I mean, could you throw kids in a class and say, let's debate something really controversial, but you have to debate it from the other side?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just as a experiment of forcing the brain to try to be effective for sake of winning, but from the other perspective or stance, it seems like a great exercise. If I were a high school teacher, that's the first thing I'd do. We'd pick the most controversial topic, and then I'd ask people to divide along that topic, and then I'd swap them into the other one and have them argue from the other one's stance.
Yeah, learning to appreciate perspectives is very.
And we'd use 14-ounce gloves. No, I'm kidding. It wouldn't be physical. It would be purely intellectual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, can we take it back to the brain for a moment, to the conversation that we were having earlier, right? So we were talking about that in our experiments and now in whole bodies of neuroscientific knowledge, we know that there is this very interesting neurobiological sort of processing difference between emotions and the thoughts that are part of those emotions, that are, the result of those emotions, that are also incipitating those emotions, right? Like that whole process, when it pertains to the direct actions, observable characteristics, behaviors, of another person or situation that you can actually pretty much directly learn or infer, as compared to when you have to bring a whole lot of conceptual content knowledge to bear, experiential knowledge, simulation capacity to bear, to be able to fully appreciate the nature of a situation. And we talked about how that second kind of processing that I called transcendent is in essence about distancing yourself from the immediate physical situation, the observable, perceivable situation in a direct sense, and instead constructing a narrative in your mind that's built from that, but that then brings to bear all these other kinds of information that allow you to elaborate this into a narrative that takes on emotional meaning and psychological power. As a narrative, it becomes part of identity, beliefs, all that kind of stuff. And we talked about that kind of thinking being associated with the so-called default mode, which is deactivated systematically and decoupled from itself, right? The different regions aren't talking to each other. When you are in the world, acting, doing a task, paying attention, inferring the direct things that you need to notice around you. You're in the middle of playing a soccer game, the ball's coming at your head. That's not a time to stop and muse about, Title IX and girls' access to sports, right? You're gonna trip and fall, or you're gonna miss your shot at the goal, or you're gonna get hit with the ball, right? So we need to sort of manage that space in order to have these conversations. And I think what's important here is to remember that the default mode network, that is the substrate that is playing out your own sense of self and inner consciousness and self-awareness, and is also the basis on which we construct these broader inferential narratives that are the elaborative stuff of stories and beliefs, are fundamentally incompatible. The activation of those systems is fundamentally incompatible with needing to be vigilant into the immediate physical or social situation around you. So if you feel physically, emotionally, culturally, socially unsafe, and you feel that you need to watch your back, either literally or metaphorically, as you're thinking about things, neurobiologically, that situation is inconducive. It is not conducive to being able to actually conjure an alternative perspective in which you construct a meaningful narrative with alternate ethical implications, with alternate prospective possible future outcomes, with alternate views of the historical precedent or context. Being able to sort of mentally time travel into the space of those ideas is only really possible when people feel safe to think together.
So it sounds like it's anti-creative.
Yes, creativity is also associated with the activations of these networks. Yeah, causally so in some recent work.
I had the good fortune of having dinner last year with somebody, I won't reveal who it is, but he runs a major social media platform. And he told me that in Japan, it's common for people to have 2 or 3 or even as many as 7 different social media handles.
Yeah.
and that they do this in order to embody different versions of themselves safely.
Yeah.
So these are not troll accounts. These are not the accounts. And by the way, I see you troll accounts that say whatever, and then you go to their accounts as some private account where they hide. Rather, these are individuals who have multiple accounts. In one account, they might be a bit aggressive, maybe even a bully online, dare I say. In another account, they might be very fawning and show up as the person that everyone knows them to be in the real world. In another account, they might be a university professor. In another, they're an athlete. And it's fabricated in the sense that the posts that they put up often don't accurately represent who they are in the real world.
Yeah.
But it's accurate in the sense that it represents the different dimensions of their persona that are driving their real world decision making at some level.
It's kind of like pretend play for little kids.
It's pretend play, but it's not pretend because it's in cyberspace. I'll just go back to Rick Rubin, who, in addition to being this incredible music producer, is an enormous fan of professional wrestling for many years. And I asked him, from a perplexed stance, like, why professional wrestling? He said the athleticism. And he said it's the only thing that's real because everyone agrees it's not real. And so these are characters, right? So you're agreeing for it to not be real, and yet it allows these characters to fully embody these different personas. And I had the experience years ago. I was at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Summer Camp for Scientists, where I attended and taught. And I was in a cab driving out to Cold Spring Harbor from the train station, Syosset. And I got into a discussion with the cab driver, and he said, okay, you're from California. He said with a New York accent, which I won't try and imitate. He said, you're from California. And he said, your governor, who at the time was Schwarzenegger, he said, he's great. And I said, tell me more. I happen to like Schwarzenegger for a number of reasons. He actually signed my PhD because he was governor, and I went to a UC. So, and he said, well, because if terrorists show up in California, he's going to go out there with a machine gun and take them down. So in his head, adult mind,
the Terminator.
He's the Terminator. He's the Terminator. And I realized in that moment, this was a smart guy. This cab driver was a smart guy, that it wasn't a lack of narrative distancing.
No.
He had conflated the actor with the roles he played. Yeah. And I realized in that moment that this was not a reflection of him being unintelligent. It was a reflection of the fact that the brain often collapses identities of others and makes these. I think it's just an efficient way.
Sufficient.
It's an efficient way to parse the world.
Yeah, we decide, and then that's that kind of this person, and we put them over there on a shelf.
Right.
Yeah.
So to return to the discussion that we're having, I think that the ability to embody different aspects of self, but also the ability to transiently embody the personas of other people, and to do that in a way that allows for really thorough exploration of idea space. Yeah. I feel like can only be a good thing. Yeah. Provided it doesn't get physically violent or something. Mm-hmm. But that to me seems like the exact opposite of what's happening now, which is that people are siloing off into their camps where specific language and specific ideas are accepted and others are not. I mean, it's so interesting and perplexing and disturbing to me that the way that certain things that have nothing to do with politics get lumped with one group or the other, that it's so crazy to me on the one hand. And yet I think what you're describing seems to me the route out of all of this. I really mean that. I feel like the education system, starting young and getting people emotionally engaged, learning what they like, what they don't like, but then also teaching them about their emotional systems and how it helps them parse the world is really the solution. So that when we're upset, we can realize like, yeah, I'm upset. It makes sense why I'm upset, but let me explore it from the other side. It also makes sense why they're upset. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be what humans have done somewhat throughout history, never perfectly well, but it seems like it ought to be possible. I mean, the forebrain is there for a reason. So could you, in wanting to go back to a little bit of the biology and the research, what have you seen in terms of cross-cultural consistency about the role of emotions in our ability to parse and learn? And because obviously we're not going to solve these problems today, but although I think you've shine light on some potential solutions. I mean, what do we know for sure about human beings and their capacity to do what you're describing, to really learn differently? It worked in the classroom where you were teaching, but how could each and every one of us do this? I mean, how would we approach this? I guess I want to take this to the practical.
Yeah.
What can we do when we read a newspaper article? What can we do when we're on social media? What can we do when our kid is like refusing to do something because they simply don't like it, or the teacher, they don't like the teacher? Mm-hmm. Are there paths through that you've identified or that you can sense work?
I can give funny examples of my own kids when they didn't like things at school, right? This isn't licensed.
What tools do you use? I mean,
licensed to not. Well, yeah. So my son, when he was in third grade, he was very upset about the behavior chart that his teacher had at school, right? So he had a behavior chart. They had a behavior chart at the back of the room. The principal didn't agree with this, but that teacher was there for a year. And okay, so there was this behavior chart, and you have green. You start on green with your little clip, and then there's yellow, and then there's red, which is like call your parents. Which I never understood why they don't put call your parents on the green. But anyway, right? So you start on the green, and then you get down to the yellow, and then you get down to red, and there's Ted's little friend is always getting on the red by 9 a.m. It's like, could we just get it over with? And he tried to talk with his teacher about why this behavior chart made him so uncomfortable and she could not understand his perspective, because she kept saying, but you're always on green. You're always doing what you're supposed to be doing, and you're respectful and you're well behaved. So why is it a problem? And what he was trying to say was that somehow it just made him uncomfortable to have that there. So he was constantly bothering me with this. I finally told him I was trying to work one day, and he was home from school, because I would let him work from home some days because we needed to kind of buffer a little bit. And, he'd bring all his work home and he'd do it himself. I'd be working, he'd be working, right? It's fine. He had all kinds of projects going on, And this is a kid who, just a little side story. This is a kid who went to first grade, and about 2 weeks into first grade, good first grade class, he was crying on a Sunday night to me like, "Hey, I gotta go to school. I don't want to go to school." I'm like, "Well, what's wrong at school?" I'm thinking he's getting bullied. Something's wrong. And he's like, I know. He finally looks at me and he goes, "I have so much work to do. How do you expect me to get my work done if I'm sitting in school all day?"
I can relate.
Right?
I can relate.
Yeah. Can you relate? Because you're actually a motivated, right? We take kids' motivations and the things they're interested in, and we sideline them and try to structure them into something. So back to
there are Legos to be built.
Oh, he was way into building armor at that time. I know, we're probably terrible parents, but we gave him some safety glasses, and we taught him how to use it, and we explained how metal's sharp, and we gave him some sheet metal.
That is super cool.
And some tin snips, and he made a whole suit of armor in the backyard in second grade. Anyway, it took him months and months. I mean, chainmail, the whole bit. He was super into it.
Amazing.
I know. Anyway, and he made airplane. He did all kinds of things. But so here's this kid, and he's bugging me about his teacher and this behavior chart. And I said, "Ted, go write a letter to your teacher. If it bothers you that much, you go write a letter about why it bothers you, right? Because in doing so, he's first of all helping to solve the problem. Secondly, he was formulating his understanding of what this behavior chart is and why specifically it bothers him. And in so doing, it helps him not be so bothered by it, right? So that's an example of something you could do, right? So he wrote this letter to his teacher, which ended up being published in the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Math's book, How People Learn, Volume 2, because I was on the committee of people that wrote it, and we needed an example of kids making sense out of motivational things, and actually took his name and the teacher's name off and put the letter in the book. It basically is a little kid saying, "Listen, teacher, when you put up this behavior chart," he called it a bad behavior chart, which it wasn't. It was just a behavior chart, but he interprets it as a bad behavior chart. When you put that up, it's as if you're daring me to do something bad. You're basically, he doesn't say it like this. He says, "You're basically making me uncomfortable because you are laying out a perspective on me, a possibility space for me that you're now bringing into the conversation that I could be like that. And let's see if you're going to be. Oh, not today. Oh, we're still on green, right?" And so where does this go? It goes back to the idea that kids are, and all of us are, interpreting the interactions and the structures around us, not only for what they are, but for what they represent as somebody else's interpretation of what we are or are not capable of. And he saw that behavior chart as a marker that his teacher assumed that all kids in that class are capable of being badly behaved and that their main aim of being in school is to be well behaved, right? And so he writes all about saying, dear teacher, every day I come to school, every single day, and every single day is new. That's what he says. And I could learn something new, except then I see ... the bad behavior chart, right? He's saying school is supposed to be about learning and us engaging, and you're making it about something so low level and basic as, are you going to behave yourself today? We are insulting him by the way we frame the context. So take it back to the bigger issues of civic discourse and all these things. I think so much of the way that we're organizing our lives, our social relationships, our community, our civic structures right now is mirroring that teacher's behavior chart, right?
Did she take the chart down?
I don't know. I don't think so.
And I asked because I'm not sure that it matters. I think what probably matters is that he had the chance to voice
his understanding
of
his
it.
understanding of the chart. Yeah, that's right. And now, anybody can read his understanding of the chart because it's published in the most widely read textbook on learning, right? And motivation. I mean, there's a couple points. First is that the way we structure our environment can unwittingly impose our mental models of other people's possibility spaces onto them, and people find that inherently abhorrent, right? So think about how we're doing that in many contexts, not simply in schools. And then the second thing is, from the kid's perspective, deconstructing exactly why and something bothers you by understanding how it is that you are interpreting that thing, then opens you up to be able to manage those spaces in a new way and to engage in them in a new way. So if we take the conversation back to the idea of civic discourse, of civic reasoning, of engaging with any idea, right? There are ideas that are deeply problematic. There are ideas that are deeply hurtful, that have long histories of trauma associated with them, of long histories of power dynamics and oppression associated with them. The way in which I think we deconstruct those ideas is going to be critical to how those ideas live on implicitly in our social relationships and our society. If we cancel them, if we negate them and pretend they don't exist, all we're doing is burying them in a place where they can't be deconstructed. And only by actually taking them apart and appreciating the pain, the relationship structures, the limitations, the resource allocations, the inequities that are implicit in those concepts, only by deconstructing and deeply understanding those can we rebuild them in a different way. So it's very difficult because on the one hand, we have a space created for ourselves right now in society that is deeply unsafe for many people. And when you're in an unsafe space, you are not in a space that is conducive to constructing and deconstructing meaning, using those default mode systems and other systems, just to be crass about the brain, right, and kind of oversimplify it, that are the substrate of autobiographical self, of possibility spaces, of ethics, of deep moral and ethical emotions. So on the one hand, we have a space that is deeply unsafe for individuals to think together, and genuinely so. There are real implications for people to reveal certain kinds of identities, to engage with certain kinds of ideas in culturally formulated spaces, right, that we've constructed together. And the irony is that we can only fix that and create a different way of interacting with one another by actually boldly going in there together. So it's a very nuanced line where we need to develop skills. And this is where I think, and many people think now, that schools should be focused across disciplinary domains, whether it's math, science, social studies, history, art, the arts, right? Sports, should be focused on helping young people and teachers develop capacities and dispositions for deconstructing and constructing, again, safe cultural spaces to think together about interpretations, about narratives, about stories, about assumptions, about ideas. Because as we engage in those thoughts together, we call that civic discourse, right? We learn kind of rules for not triggering and sensibilities for not endangering another person's ability to engage on equal footing with us. Because if we trigger those unsafe, right, dangerous places for people, they can't neurobiologically then engage with us deeply around sharing their perspective and deconstructing ours together to build something where we have a shared understanding in the middle. We have to trust one another, and trusting one another really means we have to have a space established in which we can feel safe to deconstruct our own beliefs and to allow others to do the same, and to assure them that we can engage with those beliefs, no matter what they are, and then actually exteriorize them and evaluate them together and think about them around core values we probably both hold, like well-being, like sustainability of society and of cultures and of groups, right? These things are core. Everyone wants to be well. Everyone wants to have a sustainable life and a life future and a cultural set of values. And so when we all appreciate that we're bringing those things to the table, but then are systematic about constructing a space for civic discourse in which we are supporting one another in deconstructing our own beliefs rather than each other's beliefs, right? Then we are at a space where we can start to construct some kind of understanding, some kind of nuanced, more adaptive, more pro-social in the true sense way of engaging with one another, with not necessarily way of agreeing with one another, but way of engaging and constructing and deconstructing meaning together, so that we can be adaptive, so that we can build a society where everyone can flourish, so that we can build a society where everyone can belong and can actually have the resources they need.
I would argue, as long as free speech is not possible for everybody, that nobody's safe.
Yes, that's right.
That nobody's safe.
Nobody's safe.
And that there's an illusion of safety around the idea that people who have voice are going to get what they want simply because they are the ones who are allowed to talk and other people aren't.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you said it perfectly when you said that anytime ideas get buried, there's no way they can be solved.
Yeah.
I mean, we know this from the scientific literature.
Yes,
for instance, there are
absolutely.
results within social science and biological science that are deeply troubling.
Yeah.
I can think of experiments that were done in the realm of neurosurgery on humans in the 1960s. People stimulating different brain areas and seeing rage or seeing very politically controversial ideas emerge from the person's mouth in real time as a function of stimulating that brain area. And then you say, well, did they really believe that and they just never were saying it? And the person doesn't even recall that happening during the surgery. Or, I mean, this idea that Jung had that we have all things inside of us, I think can be seen as a very dangerous notion and territory, that we have all these shadows. But I'm also an optimist, and I feel that the optimistic view of it is that by knowing that we have all things inside of us potentially,
that's how we manage them.
And by embracing that fact that we can manage that, to steal what you just said, we can manage that, and that we can function so much better when we see something in the world that we think, that's not me, I'm not that, and I hate that. If we understand that that also lives inside of us, but that we just don't realize it. And I realize some people will hear this and they'll go, that's not true. I have my stances and I disagree with other things. I would say absolutely yes. But the difference between one person's stance and another person's stance could be purely developmental wiring. It could be difference of having read different childhood books and oriented towards one book versus another. I mean, I think that we are very similar at the level of core wiring and core algorithms that we run. But somehow these days, we have the perception that we've diverged so much. I think the only thing that's really missing is what you're describing is a place where any and all ideas can be explored freely, not to establish consensus
or validity of certain kinds of ideas, but to actually exteriorize them and deconstruct them for what they actually are.
Absolutely. thank you for working through that space, because it's a tricky one. I realize
it's very fraught. Yeah,
it's very fraught, but so very important. I have a question that's very basic, but I've never gotten a good answer on. I was raised thinking that mirror neurons were a real thing, that there are these neurons that exist in the brains of us and other old world primates, like macaque monkeys, but especially in humans, the so-called mirror neurons that are activated when we see somebody experience something, and it evokes a sort of empathic understanding in us. I've also seen some reviews written recently in some popular press saying that mirror neurons are perhaps not playing the critical role that we thought they were. What's the story on mirror neurons? And we're not going after anybody's work in particular. I just want to know whether or not there's real validity to this notion of mirror neurons.
I'm not an expert on it, but I can tell you what I know about it and the way that I think about it. So, I mean, I think it's pretty clear now that there are no such things as mirror neurons, like some special kind of cell type that's in the brain. That they have not been found. They were predicted, but they were not found. But something else was also predicted back in the late 1980s by Antonio Damasio, where he talked about the brain in terms of being organized in terms of what he called convergent and divergent zones. So he talked about the brain being organized as networks converging and then diverging again back out. So you have places where processing is kind of coming together, and then what happens in there then determines how things get spread back out. And you've got these sort of loops happening in the brain. And his thinking on that was very much commensurate with others thinking about the notion of goal-directed action and perception. So if you think back to developmental scholars who knew nothing about the brain very much, like Jean Piaget, right, back in the early 20th century, where he was observing young children and noticing that they were interacting with the world and they expected certain things, and they were, he thought, imposing theories or schemas onto the world, and then accommodating was the word he used, the world with their actions when it didn't act the way they expected, and then assimilating that back, right? To change what they expected next time. So that he had this model that he built from systematically observing children, 3 in particular, right? Where what he realized is that kids are not just flailing around, sort of discovering things haphazardly. They're imposing a certain logic onto the world, and then they're systematically testing that logic.
So they're hypothesis testing.
Basically, yes, right? They're expecting things, and then when the world does what they want, that reinforces, and when it does something different, that's surprising, and then they have to accommodate and make sense, and then they have to expect differently in the future. So what does this have to do with mirror neurons? I think when you bring these different ideas together, the psychological observational ideas and then the neurobiological ideas, what we basically have, and I wrote about this a little bit in I think 2008, I have a paper called something like The Smoke Around Mirror Neurons. Mm-hmm. And I forget the second half of the title, but it has the word goals and directed actions and things, right? The idea, I think, is it's not that there are special neurons that are firing when we see another person do the thing, right? But that we are, it goes back to the notion of us imposing our expectations onto the world. You have to share and understand intuitively the goal of the other one's action in order to activate these mirror regions, right? And what are those mirror regions? They are basically regions that are deeply interconnected with each other, right? They're thoroughly interconnected with each other in terms of white matter fiber tracks. And they are regions involved in action planning, goal-oriented actions, and perceiving the outcomes of those actions. Mm-hmm. So it's a kind of a loop between acting and perceiving and acting and perceiving. And I argued at the time, right, that goals are emergent, like high-level goals, are emergent from the dynamic feedback loops of acting and perceiving, right? So I was really taking a very Piagetian view, but imposing that on the neuroscience. So I think you take what I'm saying together with like a Piagetian constructivist view. There are many other constructivist neuroscientists, constructive psychologists also, and then also the neural data. What we see is that we don't have these special neurons built into our head. What we have is a natural proclivity, and I don't know where that comes from, right? But we have a natural proclivity to try to appreciate another person's actions, feelings, experiences by leveraging our own similar actions, feelings, experiences. And so when we can share goals or experiences, that becomes more facile, right? And that's been shown over and over in these mirror type papers, right? And when you distance yourself from those goals and actions or don't have an intuitive sense of them, then you don't get these mirroring activations. You don't get these kind of ramped up sharing of goals, right? Or of experience. So I think it really comes back to the way the nervous system is wired to be inherently social. We are cultural learners. We are situated in social spaces from the moment we're conceived and certainly from the moment we're born. And that social space, observing others, interacting with others, co-regulating each other's physiology, each other's attention, each other's emotion, right? As we do those things, we accommodate to each other and we wire ourselves to expect certain kinds of feelings and then to recognize those same things in other people. And so as we share constructed experience together, we start to appreciate the sameness, right? The parallels between other people's and our own emotions, thoughts, goals. And we can also, dehumanize them, make the other person not share our thoughts, emotions, goals. And then we are capable of all kinds of horrible things we've talked about before, right? Where you've actually distanced yourself. So what's the scoop on mirror neurons? I don't think mirror neurons exist. I think that's the consensus, but our propensity to engage with other people by simulating on the substrate of our own self and then inferring the goals and the feelings and the outcomes and the experiences of those experiences that we've simulated. That's what is very essential to being a human. But keeping in mind that there's also this layer of learned, lived, cultural, developed expectations we impose onto the world. And we not filter, but we steer our attention, we steer our perception to accommodate, to align with our expectations. So it's never just the reality of what the person experienced or what happened. It's always our perception of that reality as we expected it to happen. So there's this very dynamic cultural co-construction happening that is messy, that is iterative, that you can learn to do in different ways, in different contexts. And that's kind of how I understand this notion of mirroring.
Well, before we conclude, I do want to answer your son's question.
Oh,
so prior to recording, there was a text message that came. We don't have to read it verbatim, but the text message, Mary Ellen's son, is late teenage years, and he's been doing deliberate cold exposure, cold showers on a daily basis, and reported that he hasn't had any colds since starting this. This is actually a pretty common experience because the pulse and adrenaline that is inevitable with a uncomfortably cold but safe.
Yeah, no, he jumps
shower.
out of bed in the morning, does a whole bunch of exercises to get warm, and then jumps in a freezing cold shower.
Amazing. That spike of adrenaline we know is neuroprotective.
Yep.
If it's a short-lived spike in adrenaline, you don't want chronically
No,
elevated.
you don't want chronic stress.
Yeah.
That's not good for
That's
you.
not good.
Yeah.
We know that from the beautiful work of Bruce McEwen and Bob Sapolsky and others.
Gorgeous work, yeah.
Yeah. So, but then he asked, should he get sick? Should he continue the cold showers? And the answer is no.
Oh.
I think that then it would be hot showers and hot baths and sauna type stuff is probably better, but not so hot that it's stressful.
Yeah.
You really want to reduce stress on an ill system.
Yeah.
So he sounds for many reasons like a remarkable young man. As is your daughter. It sounds like a remarkable.
They're both wonderful.
And listen, and you're remarkable. And
Thank you.
I really mean that. I feel like we could go on forever exploring these ideas. I absolutely would love to have you back for another discussion or
pleasure.
many about your research. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your research schedule, your teaching schedule to come educate us today. These ideas are so vitally important and you provide so many real world examples. In fact, it's one of the things that I love so much about your work is that it's really nested in real world applications.
Thank you.
And your thoughts and perspectives on the education and how it could be better at the level of educating kids at home, teaching ourselves, teachers, and the education system, I hope will ring far and wide, because they really can be implemented.
Yeah.
We're not talking about the need to purchase a bunch of stuff.
No, we need to start with a different disposition. We need to start with a different goal. Yeah. The goal of education needs to learning's not the goal. It's not the outcome. It needs to be the development of the person, right? How is a person changing themselves having learned this? And then you design the learning opportunities to change who people are capable of becoming, right? So the learning is there, but it's not the end point. It's just the means to something else, which we haven't been attending to enough. And that's the development of the person, who they become having learned that.
Beautifully put. Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for the work you do. And I can't wait to have another discussion with you about the emerging research.
Oh, great. I'll be back.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me today for my discussion about emotions, social interactions, and learning with Dr. Mary Helen Immordino Yang. I hope you found the conversation to be as informative and enriching as I did. If you'd like to learn more about Dr. Immordino Yang's research, please find the link to her laboratory website in the show note captions. In addition, Dr. Immordino Yang authored an incredible book called Emotions, Learning, and the Brain. It's a book designed for the general public. It's incredibly informative and has a lot of practical tools as well. We've provided a link to that book in the show note captions. If you're learning from and or enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's a terrific zero-cost way to support us. In addition, please subscribe to the podcast on both Spotify and Apple. And on both Spotify and Apple, you can leave us up to a 5-star review. If you have questions for me or comments about the podcast or guests that you'd like me to include on the Huberman Lab podcast, please put those in the comment section on YouTube. I do read all the comments. Please also check out the sponsors mentioned at the beginning and throughout today's episode. That's the best way to support this podcast. Not on today's episode, but on many previous episodes of the Huberman Lab podcast, we discuss supplements. While supplements aren't necessary for everybody, many people derive tremendous benefit from them for things like enhancing sleep, for hormone support, and for focus. The Huberman Lab podcast is proud to have partnered with Momentous Supplements. To see the supplements discussed on the Huberman Lab podcast, go to Live Momentous, spelled O-U-S. So that's livemomentous.com/Huberman. Again, that's livemomentous.com/Huberman. If you're not already following us on social media, I am Huberman Lab on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And at all those places, I discuss science and science-related tools, some of which overlaps with the content of the Huberman Lab podcast, but much of which often does not overlap with the content of the Huberman Lab podcast. So again, it's Huberman Lab on all social media platforms. In addition, if you haven't subscribed to our Neural Network newsletter, it's a zero-cost monthly newsletter that provides summaries of podcast episodes as well as toolkits. For instance, toolkits for optimizing sleep, or toolkits for learning and neuroplasticity, or for deliberate cold exposure, or for dopamine, and on and on. To sign up for the Neural Network newsletter, simply go to hubermanlab.com, go to the menu, scroll down to newsletter, and provide your email. We do not share your email with anybody. Thank you once again for joining me for today's discussion with Dr. Mary Helen Immordino Yang. And last but certainly not least, thank you for your interest in science.